welcome to Pluribus Unum's Fireside Chats. Not as good as a few hours, but hey, it's something. Now, this episode is one that I've actually been looking forward to making in a long while. In fact, I think this isn't like the one that made me want to do like the elections mini-series of this year, I guess. If that's a thing now, I guess. But this is one that definitely is worth talking about, especially considering this one is pretty soon going to be overshadowed by another Latin American election that a lot of people on the online left probably already know a hefty amount about. And hopefully this episode is going to make it so that this election is talked about a lot more up to the election itself. In fact, this one actually made me kind of contemplate doing things in a little bit of a different order, but I'm probably still going to keep it in the same order that I usually do it. But before we get into all the important stuff of this episode, I'm going to start off with a little bit of a joke. What happens when you mix a progressive, a liberal, and a communist? You get this week's shout-out, the AltLeftPodcast. As the name suggests, it's a podcast that is supposedly of an alternative version of the left. I guess they're in a vein of the dirtbag left, which I guess is the same thing I would fit under. I mean, if you go to their Twitter, AltLeftPod, the pinned tweet is literally like, fuck civility, so definitely in that same vein. For starters, I really do like the concept of this idea. The idea of three very different, and I know this is a thing, because I've made fun of this sort of type of idea before with Rising, but this is technically a bit different because it seems like these guys are all on the same general side of the political aisle. So it's not like a right-winger, a communist, and a fascist coming together. It's like people of the general same side of the political aisle. You know, these guys are basically the multi-tendency podcast. I haven't watched much of their stuff, but I probably will end up watching way more of their stuff. The one episode that I've seen a lot of is their 66th episode where they talk about fake leftists. I don't necessarily agree with all the things they say. I mean, the two people they focus on are Jimmy Dore and Vosh, but I do kind of see the points that they were trying to make with Vosh, even though some of them are points that I've technically already talked about in my Vosh episode. I think honestly maybe they could have changed it up and would have been talking about Hassan, because Hassan is sort of more of the idea of a champagne socialist, I guess is a term you would use. But then again, they were also mostly focusing on Vosh's foreign policy in regards to NATO and stuff, so I guess technically it wouldn't fit. But disagreements aside, I think their show is well put together and you should probably check them out. If not for any of the stuff I said before, but due to the fact that one of them sounds almost identical to Sam Cedar. I don't know which one they are, the liberal, the communist, or the progressive. And depending on which one it is, you might hear Sam Cedar saying something that Sam Cedar would never say. But anyways, to get off of that, let's get right into the news. First, 2.5 Latin American W's. First, Chile. Chile has officially finalized a new draft constitution. They have officially brought together a new constitution that will be voted on in a referendum. They haven't posted an explicit, full thing of the constitution, but from the stuff that the constitution has stated, here are some of the things that are enshrined in this new constitution. Higher education will be free. It ensures gender parity across government and makes the state responsible for preventing, adapting, and mitigating climate change. It will also offer the first constitutional recognition of Chile's indigenous population, which will also include restitution for historically indigenous lands. And one of the biggest things that it's going to get rid of is something that for some reason I never found out about until now. You see, apparently, in Chile, it is explicitly law that you cannot nationalize water. Apparently, it's not just you can't nationalize things at all. Granted, I'm pretty sure that is in the Constitution, but apparently there's a specific clause that makes sure that water remains privatized. And, they literally call it like Chile's private water system. It's like, what? Now, while that is kind of a W, there is a little bit of a tiny L in there, because due to the long process that has taken to get the Constitution, a lot of people are a bit hesitant to sign it, and it is currently not favored to pass. Granted, maybe they'll be able to campaign well on if the Constitution will be passed, but maybe not. Maybe it will end up failing. But some people are also taking that as also a W, because the indigenous population in Chile has said, no matter if the Constitution passes or not, we've won, because now we are directly enshrined in the Chilean political process, and we can't be removed at this point. So I guess take your W's where you can get them, folks. Hopefully Chile will be able to finally get rid of this Constitution, and they'll be able to actually do lots of good. Speaking of countries that have been able to change things, Venezuela. It seems that the US is taking a vastly different approach to Venezuela than they have previously. Biden is set to ease a lot of sanctions against Venezuela. Now you might say, why? Well, it seems that the reason why is because it seems that they are trying to make it so that Guaido has a shot back into being a viable political force in Venezuela, because Guaido announced that his opposition faction will start holding their presidential primaries. And of course, I would assume the US probably wants them to be involved in the upcoming Venezuelan election. So basically, US is going to be easing up on a lot of the sanctions so that Guaido is seen as a more viable political force, and Maduro will probably stop focusing as intently on trying to silence him. And the thing is, I have no clue at this point if this is going to work. I mean, easing sanctions of Venezuela is a good thing. Hopefully that'll lead to more prosperous Venezuela. But, you see, Venezuelan opposition has notoriously just not been handled well. Like, I mean, if they were handled well, maybe Maduro wouldn't be president right now. The Venezuelan opposition has been notoriously divided into multiple different factions. You see, there are 4, technically 5, maybe back to 4 coalitions in Venezuelan politics. There's the Great Patriotic Pole, which is the, like, Chavismo one. There's the Democratic Alliance, which is the more center-left opposition. There's the Democratic Unity Roundtable, which is the more centrist or right-wing opposition. Then there's the Popular Revolutionary Alternative, which is a explicitly communist group that technically sort of is friends with the Bolivarian one. And then there's also, I mean, Guaido's opposition thing isn't even put here, but they call, I think it's called something like the umbrella of something. But again, it's basically, Guaido's one is essentially a nothing burger. And the 2 more explicit opposition coalitions have basically had this weird sort of relationship with Venezuelan elections. Sometimes they will run against each other, and then sometimes they might align with each other very briefly. And then there are other times, which is very common, that one or both of them will just boycott the elections as if that will somehow magically make people like them more. I think the DUP is the more explicitly bad alternative to Venezuela's politics, but I don't know. Maybe in a couple of years I'll be talking about the Venezuelan election in this series. I mean, it will happen, probably. Speaking of things that are happening, let's talk about the baby food shortage. Remember that? You see, I didn't know if this was a very big thing to talk about. Well, that sounds really weird, but bear with me. You see, I didn't know if this was going to be a big political thing, like the baby food shortage. But then, sure enough, it ended up becoming a big political thing when a certain person came to the forefront of politics talking about this, Marjorie Taylor Greene. You see, Marjorie Taylor Greene, in a Ukraine vote, all of a sudden, randomly started talking about, like, you're going to vote for this $4 billion, like $400 billion Ukraine thing, and what was it, 400 billion? No, that is way too much. Like 4 million or 400 million, something like that. Basically, you're voting for X amount of money to go to Ukraine, and said we got babies home starving, and then we got a bunch of people on the left that were basically saying, yes, Marjorie Taylor Greene owned AOC. She showed that AOC is a fake shill fraud for voting against this, like for voting for this bill to send money to Ukraine when we got a baby food shortage. People like Socialist MMA, Jackson Hinkle, Jimmy Dore, some random communist in my thread that said this proved that Marjorie Taylor Greene was further to the left than AOC and Bernie. And it's like, no. And they said, no, what I'm saying is that, you see, AOC and Bernie are acting more like fascists than Marjorie Taylor Greene. And it's like, you're still saying that she is further to the left than Bernie and AOC. And they're like, you're clearly missing my point. It's like, I'm interpreting your point very clearly, obviously, but you're just changing the wording of it, literally. But all these people all of a sudden went real quiet when something happened. 2 bills came to the House floor to actually address the baby food shortage. One measure would help enable recipients to buy formula by giving the Agriculture Secretary the permanent flexibility to waive certain requirements. The Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Poor Women, Infants, and Children, known as WIC, that limit the brands and quantities of formula that WIC recipients may purchase, while requiring that formula manufacturers have contingency plans for protecting against disruptions in supply in the event of a recall. The second measure was to provide an extra $28 million to the FDA to help get fraudulent formula products off store shelves and boost the part of the workforce focused on formula, as well as FDA inspection staff. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the person that they were praising and saying, oh, she outflanked the squad, voted against both of those measures. Marjorie Taylor Greene literally played them right in front of our very eyes. She did the thing that Republicans are known for doing, pointing at a problem, but then not actually doing anything to address the problem. She'll talk all day long about how there's a baby food shortage, but when the bills come to actually address the baby food shortage, they vote no. Republicans will say, oh, these poor white factory workers, we need to help them. Okay, what's your plan? Oh, our poor homeless vets. Okay, what's the plan? Are you going to do anything to address these problems? Man, big tech censorship is really bad. Okay, then what's the plan? What's your solution to the problem? That's literally the Republican playbook. They point at a problem, and then they go, man, that's a huge problem. Anyways, and they spend their time talking about things that are literally not problems. Like literally in one of the tweets where she talks about the baby food shortage, most people forgot, like literally in the next sentence, she was talking about closing the borders. Almost as if that wasn't a problem for them. It's just, I honestly do not understand what is this appeal on the people on the left to try and make the Republicans look good. They're not. It's literally the generation, like the first generation of the people who are sort of in the Dorite train were like, of course we don't talk about Republicans because Republicans are obviously bad. And then the next generation, they still go on that notion. But then by the third generation, it's like, oh, well, that notion doesn't even exist to them anymore. All they've been raised upon is, oh, we talk about Democrats all the time because Democrats are bad and Democrats are bad. It's literally the same thing. Like, there were Greens and people who were supposedly like on the far left that were like, oh, the Democrats, all they do is blah, blah, blah. But, like, what are they going to do now that we have a baby food shortage? It's like, they literally passed a bill right now to address it. And then the next sentence, they're like, oh, yeah, but why didn't they do anything before? It's like, it's literally the meme. Like, there's a literal meme. Everybody, I don't know, I can't find it, but there's a meme. It's like, every road leads to fuck the Democrats. Democrats do something bad? Fuck the Democrats. Republicans do something bad? Democrats should have stopped them. Fuck the Democrats. Republicans do something good. Why didn't the Democrats do it? Fuck the Democrats. But if the Democrats do something good, well, why didn't they do it sooner? Or why didn't they do anything better? Fuck the Democrats. It's just so dumb. And it's like, they'll lump every single Democrat in the same vein. It's like, oh, AOC is just like Joe Manchin. It's like, what? But anyways, we're getting off the topic, so let's just move on to the next thing. New York just got into a heavy amount of issues with their congressional districts. You see, apparently, a Cuomo-appointed judge thought that the last districts were too unfair for somebody, so they decided to redraw the districts. And when these districts were redrawn, it was basically like a limbo. People didn't know what was going to happen next. And the second that they would be revealed, it was going to shift how New York politics was. And sure enough, when it was revealed what the district borders were, New York politics did shift a little bit. First, New York District 12 was redrawn, so that it is now in an incumbent versus incumbent primary with Jerry Nadler running against Carolyn Maloney. There's already a progressive in the seat named Rain Abdelhamid, but unfortunately, I don't know if she's still in the seat, or if she is, I don't think her chances have been improved. But the focus of this part comes from a different Maloney, Sean Patrick Maloney. You see, Sean Patrick Maloney, he was in District 18. But then, due to redrawing, the district went from safe blue to leans blue, as in the tilt is still in the D's favor, but by a decently less large margin. So literally, the second the new borders were drawn, he made the announcement that he will be running in New York 17, which is a safe blue seat. However, that led to a problem, because that seat has an incumbent by the name of Mondaire Jones. Mondaire Jones is a progressive incumbent. He was one of the first two black gay men to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He's not like a Justice Democrat or like a DSA member or a squad member. He's more of like a progressive caucus member. Like, he's more like in that vein of progressive, but, you know, he's still reasonably progressive on all things considered. I mean, I like Mondaire Jones, but, I mean, he's definitely not like an AOC, but he's also definitely not a Richie Torres. But anyways, Jones was now put in a very difficult situation. While he was technically already running for re-election, he was only doing it on paper, and he would have to formally announce a candidacy this time around because of the redrawn seats. And since Sean Patrick Maloney did it first, Mondaire Jones would come off as if he was challenging Maloney, and I don't know, that would have been seen as like a taboo, but he was in luck. Turns out that due to this redistricting, his house was drawn into another district, so technically he could run in that one. However, there was a problem. That was the district of Jamal Bowman. So if he ran in that seat, it would be a progressive v. progressive challenge, which is probably what they were intending to do, because this does happen. When basically they're redrawing districts, they usually try to make it so that two people that are of a similar political viewpoint end up in the same vein, and one just happens to veer a little bit more favorably to the establishment as opposed to the other one. Like, for example, in North Carolina, they did this in the 2010 elections where it was like Brad Miller v. David Price. That same cycle had a more prominent example with Dennis Kucinich being drawn in the seat of Marcy Kaptur, and presumably this would be a similar situation. Mondaire Jones and Jamal Bowman would have to fight each other, and potentially, maybe this wasn't even intended to hurt Mondaire Jones, because Mondaire Jones is probably a lot more in line with the mainstream Democratic Party than Jamal Bowman. You know, Jamal Bowman is a DSAer. So now, Jones was put in a very difficult situation on what to do next. Was he going to run against Jamal Bowman, or would he run against Sean Patrick Maloney? It was unclear what he would do. Many people were wondering if the Democrats were even going to challenge these districts, because, you know, they were making a big deal about how a lot of black members of Congress were being drawn to battle each other, you know, Bowman and Mondaire Jones. But unfortunately, the seats ended up being finalized, and they're pretty much stuck with them at the moment. Literally, the hour after they were finalized, I think, Mondaire Jones made a really interesting announcement stating that he would then decide to run for re-election in New York District 10. Now, you might say, that's a bit weird, seeing that he decides to run in District 10, but it gets even more interesting when you actually know more than the numbers. You see, the numbers of a district don't necessarily mean the district is near or further apart. Sometimes districts are close to each other even though they're vastly different numbered. But apparently, New York District 10, the current one, is 2 hours away from 17. So he's literally moving 2 hours away to run in a completely new area. And many people are like, what? People are so perplexed as to why Mondaire Jones made this decision. And I think I know why. Because literally, there was no winning option for him in these two scenarios. Like, I mean, well, technically there was one, and I would have supported the one that I would have wanted him to do. I'll even let you know which one I want him to do. But, like, think about it. One is him running against Jamal Bowman, a person he agrees with pretty much on 90% of policy. And on the other one, he has to run against a top head of the Democratic Party. That's definitely an uphill battle, even if they're both going in as incumbents. However, we know that it's not an impossible feat. AOC did that with someone who probably is of a higher stature than DCCC had. And I don't think Mondaire Jones has that capability of doing that. Because you see, here's the thing. Mondaire Jones isn't a Justice Democrat. Most people don't remember this. He's not a Justice Democrat. He's not even endorsed by them. And that's one of the big differences between him and the Justice Democrats, aside from the endorsement. Unlike most of the Justice Democrats, Mondaire Jones did not beat an incumbent Democrat. Jones won an open seat. He started his campaign against an incumbent Democrat, but the incumbent dropped out before the votes actually ended up happening. Not every Justice Democrat has run in that manner, but 7 of them have, and they're a lot more keen on doing so again. Like, Roe was heavily floated as a potential Senate candidate against Alex Padilla. And many people are even saying that this might have actually cost Jones his re-election bid because he's moving to a completely different area with no basis in that seat and is going to try and carpetbag his way into the position. Now, while that might be true, you might also say, well, at least Mondaire Jones didn't do anything to try and hurt progressivism in that area. At least he tried to maintain his principles and make sure that everything goes hunky-dory. And as you can tell, I'm building up to the fact that he might not have, because 2 people who claim to be of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party have also decided to throw their hat in the ring almost immediately after Mondaire Jones threw his hat in the ring. And many people already pointed out the fact that they were planning to announce their bids long before Mondaire Jones gave a special surprise. Those 2 people being Yuh-Line and Bill de Blasio. In fact, I was originally going to include Bill de Blasio in his own separate story because I was going to make like basically a poll saying like, hey, should we support Bill de Blasio? Because as a non-New Yorker, I'm not necessarily tainted by all of the bad things that he's done in New York City. And all I see him as is a person who has fought for progressive issues and dropped out and endorsed Bernie in 2020. A thing that we can't say for certain other people in the race at that time period. And the same thing can be said about Yuh-Line. I don't necessarily know much about her except for the fact that she endorsed Elizabeth Warren in 2020. Unlike Raul Grijalva or other people of that nature, I can't necessarily look towards a long-standing record to counteract that. Like, I mean, I give Raul Grijalva a pass because I can look at who Raul Grijalva is. I can't do that with Yuh-Line because I'm not in her area. I don't have that much access to the stuff that she's done. Maybe she's a great candidate. Same thing with Alexandra Biaggi. Maybe they're phenomenal candidates. Maybe they are so phenomenal that them being warned Democrats doesn't even matter, like some people that might end up becoming members of Congress soon. But maybe they're not. I've done this before. Deb Haaland, she stinks. Katie Porter, I don't think she's that good. I think Katie Porter's the Katie Porter love is overrated. Would I be opposed to like Biaggi or Yuh-Line being members of Congress? No, not necessarily. But then again, I also wouldn't necessarily be opposed to Bill de Blasio being a member of Congress. But at this point, it doesn't even matter because Mondaire Jones is running. He still has the advantage of incumbency, and he's a progressive candidate, so, I mean, I don't know. New York 10 is going to be a shit show, and it's going to be hilarious to see what happens in that race. Speaking of races, a lot happened recently in Oregon, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and of course, my home state of North Carolina. And in this section, we're going to be talking about all the important ones, basically all the ones that most people either on the online left or just generally were paying attention to, which means, of course, I'm not going to talk about all of the races. We're only going to talk about the ones that are important to me or the general online left, or maybe even just funny tidbits. And the way we're going to work this is that we're going to focus on the districts basically sort of like reverse chronologically. So like, for example, it'll be like District 7, District 6, District 5, District 4, and then build up to like the Senate race, if that is important to talk about, which usually it is. And we're first going to start off with the state that held its primaries the last, Oregon. In Oregon District 6, I was backing a candidate by the name of Andrea Salinas. And sure enough, she actually managed to win. She was the most progressive of all the candidates, even though technically she's just basically a left Warren Dem, I guess. Maybe I'll end up just removing her after she wins, because I don't know if she's going to be a Deb Haaland or an Ayanna Pressley. We'll have to wait and see. Her win is notable for another reason, but we'll get into that at the end of this section. Next is a race that I wasn't backing anybody in, but was already a big, attention focus. Oregon District 5. That one was very contentious because a lot of people were backing Jamie McLeod Skinner over the incumbent Democrat Kurt Schrader. And surprisingly, she actually managed to pull it off and beat him. Basically, every progressive organization and big progressive figure that I seemed to notice was backing Jamie McLeod Skinner. However, I really couldn't find any reason why they were, aside from just anti-Schrader hate. Literally, they're just they don't like Schrader, so they just back whoever is running against him. If it was Mark Gamba who was running against him, that'd be cool. But Mark Gamba did endorse Jamie, so maybe she's better than I know. She literally said during a debate section that she posted that basically running to the left of Schrader is basically just running as a Democrat, so I don't know. Oregon District 4, which used to be held by Peter DeFazio, was now turned into an open seat when he decided to retire. The candidate that I was backing was the progressive who ran against him, Doyle Canning. And unfortunately, she ended up losing to Val Hoyle, who was another Warren Dem, but seems to be more of the generic lib Warren Dem. Her losing was kind of expected. I was hoping maybe she'd pull a Sheila McCormick thing, but unfortunately she didn't. Oregon District 3, there was actually an incumbent that I liked, Earl Blumenauer. He managed to win re-election relatively easy. And now the Senate race in Oregon. While there was technically no one we were rooting for in the Senate race, the incumbent Senator Ron Wyden easily won his primary, and it seems that the person who will end up running against him is a QAnon person who ran against Jeff Merkley in the last cycle. But I only wanted to talk about this race because of a specific candidate running. The candidate in question is named Ibrahim Tahir. For those who have no clue who Ibrahim Tahir is, he is also a person who ran in the last election. They were the nominee of the Pacific Green Party and the Oregon Progressive Party. And he made himself well known as part of a specific faction of the Green Party in 2020. More specifically, the Chad Wilson, Cynthia McKinney, David Rold faction of the Green Party. Now that's bad enough, but here's the thing. In this cycle, he basically confirmed a very obvious thing about that faction of the Green Party, because he's not running as a Green in this cycle. He ran as a Republican in this cycle. Oh, and I'm not talking about like I'm running as like a progressive Republican like Rob Riercy or something like that. I mean, Tahir literally ran as a basic, normal-ass Republican. Listen to these are specific platform planks from his website in this cycle. COVID-9/11 is a war on the people. The political event weaponized science, defamed it, and used it to usher in a system that resembles slavery. The principles of liberty, free market, family values, societal utilities, peace, and morality must be pillars of our laws. The right of the Second Amendment cannot be regulated, controlled, or restricted by the government. The government cannot interfere in the patient-doctor relationship, nor regulate medicine, or be in control of the healthcare system. The federal government especially has no right to influence, regulate, control healthcare. Protecting the planet and the environment must not be confused by the scientifically invalid claims of the climate change movement. Tahir literally is a climate change denier now. This doesn't happen in normal society. But anyways, let's move on to the next state, Kentucky. And we're going to be in a similar vein. Okay, so in Kentucky District 6, we have something very interesting happen. Jeff Young has actually finally won a primary. He won that district's Democratic primary. In fact, funnily enough, he actually beat a Marianne Williamson endorsed candidate. That's weird. But this guy is rather interesting. One of his first policy plank on his website is abolish the CIA. And I'm gonna be like, ooh, based. But I don't think I'll end up being endorsing in this cycle, because apparently Jeff Young has kind of went on that weird, like, tanky trend, you know, like the one of, like, the Jackson Hinkles of, like, oh, Ukraine is actually the aggressor or something. Basically, like, saying, like, oh, Putin is in the right in some way. I don't know. But he's basically been disavowed by his party at this point. So that's just an interesting fact. This is going to be the last time he ever wins anything, I'll be real. But speaking of not winning, Kentucky District 3. Attica Scott, unfortunately, lost her primary. And she lost it to a guy by the name of Morgan McGarvey. However, there are a lot of reasons why that may have happened. One, I'm again going to get into in the last part of this section. But one of the ones that might have caused this is actually, I think, Breonna Taylor's family. Okay, so I didn't know this at the time, but like, Breonna Taylor's family seemed to actually get heavily involved in this race. You see, Attica Scott originally announced that she would run against the incumbent Democrat of this seat, John Yarmuth, which is what made me suspicious of her originally, which apparently irked Breonna Taylor's family, who had formed a very close relationship with John Yarmuth and endorsed his re-election bid. However, as you can tell, since he's not listed as a candidate in this race, he didn't end up running for re-election and instead dropped out. And then he ended up endorsing Morgan McGarvey's candidacy. McGarvey seemed to take the route that I think Yarmuth wanted, and he announced after Yarmuth retired. Apparently McGarvey isn't even that bad ideologically. Like, I looked at his website, and sure enough, one of the things that seemed to be poignant of this cycle was many news cycles were saying like McGarvey and Scott were, well, very similar ideologically, and really the only difference between the two was like their skin tones and genders. But of course, we'll have to wait and see. I'm not gonna endorse them immediately right off the bat, which normally I would do, but in this case I wouldn't. I gotta wait to see whether or not he actually is living up to what he's saying. And of course, the biggest one for the state is Charles Booker winning the Senate seat. It was pretty much expected. Literally nobody even came close. That's seemingly a theme for the Senate races, because they're not really that close. Anyways, now on to my home state of North Carolina. In North Carolina District 14, Jeff Jackson beat Ram Mamadov. It was expected, and it kind of stinks that Jeff still doesn't have a platform, even though he's been running for office for like over 200 days. I think it's even been over 400 days at this point. Anyways, North Carolina District 13, Wiley Nickel won. Now, Wiley Nickel is interesting because he's actually pretty progressive, at least for, I guess, his seat. And this is really good because this seat is actually a toss-up now, so maybe Nickel has a shot. His opponent might make things easier no matter which way he decides to run his campaign, because the GOP nominee is a guy by the name of Bo Hines, who is basically a walking version of Madison Cawthorn in appearance, but apparently, ideologically, he's trying to be more of the anti-Cawthorn, like saying that he has no interest in being the next Cawthorn. Speaking of Cawthorn, in North Carolina District 11, Madison Cawthorn actually lost his primary bid to Chuck Edwards. Now, this really isn't like a W. It's sort of a W, but like basically, the only reason why this is a W is just because Cawthorn won't be in the House next cycle. And I actually want to take this opportunity to explain something. To all the people who thinks that AOC needs to be less friendly to the Democrats, she needs to be harsher to the Democrats, she needs to be more like smash everything, and I'm not here to make friends, I'm not here to form like political alliances, I'm here to like I'm here to stir shit. Like people of that vein, this is what it gets you. Cawthorn lost because he literally did that. He stirred too much crap for the GOP to handle, so the North Carolina GOP just decided, screw it, we're going to do everything in our power to get rid of you. Sure enough, that ended up happening. In North Carolina District 4, unfortunately, Nita Alam lost. And apparently, the Clay Aiken got like third, not even third, maybe, did he get fourth? I don't know. He got third or fourth. But apparently, Fushi is similar to McGarvey and is not that bad, but I don't know if I will endorse her because, I don't know, like, she was apparently good enough for the North Carolina Progressive Caucus to endorse her. They rescinded it, but they ended up endorsing her nonetheless. But I don't know if she'll be endorsed or not. Okay, next seat is North Carolina District 1, where Dawn Davis beat Erica Smith. Now, this is a very conflicted race. I'm glad that Erica Smith lost, but couldn't she have lost to Nita Alam? Did she have to lose to freaking Dawn Davis? But here's the thing, like, I expected Erica Smith to lose because Erica Smith, she just has too much baggage. Like, all these progressive organizations who are trying so desperate, like, I mean, I'm really mad at, like, a lot of, like, there's one person who DM'd me out of the blue. I don't even remember their ad, but they basically said, like, it sucks because, honestly, North Carolina wasted a ton of their resources into Erica Smith. And that's my point. That's the reason why I've been calling out Erica Smith the entire time. It's like, you're wasting your energy on Erica Smith. Erica Smith does not deserve your energy. All of the stuff that Dawn Davis people were using to smear Erica Smith, you know, the stuff like she's not a real Democrat, she endorsed Republicans, she's worked with Republicans, she's like one of the highest ranked officials with Republicans. All that stuff was true. And then I saw all these progressive organizations like the Sunrise Movement, Brand New Congress, like all these guys were trying so desperately hard to try and paint this in a different light. But it's like, guys, it's true. All this information is true. Stop trying to paint this as a positive light to Smith. Like, they were trying to merely be like, oh, it's funny that Davis said this because Davis, he's anti-abortion. It's like, guys, anti-abortion Dems exist in North Carolina. They are very prominent. We had one in Congress not that long ago, Heath Schuler. A large faction of the North Carolina Democratic Party is conservative. One of the people who is in that faction is Erica Smith. You wasted so much resources on Erica Smith when Nita Alam desperately needed your help. If Erica Smith lost to any other Democrat, I would have been like dancing around. But I can't even take the W because she lost to freaking Dawn Davis. Anyways, the North Carolina Senate race, Cherry Beasley won with like 80% of the vote, and the person I voted for, James Carr, actually got second place. That was actually a surprise. I actually didn't think that he would actually do it, but he actually managed to do it. I'm basically waiting for the Green Party candidate, Matt Haw, to qualify. And the last state was Pennsylvania. First, we're going to start off with District 3, actually, because it's the only L that technically could be done. You see, there was apparently this huge push for Alexandra Hunt in Pennsylvania District 3. She was a former sex worker, or maybe current sex worker, I don't know, who was running a candidacy against a pretty right-wing Democrat. And basically, that was her shtick. Like, oh, she's the sex worker who was running for election. OnlyFans even did a thing where they were like showing like her and promoting her, but I didn't back her because, it just clearly didn't work out. In Pennsylvania District 2, Summer Lee actually managed to have a very close, slim margin to beat the conservative Democrat Steve Irwin. Like, it was a really close margin. Like, it was, like, I mean, they basically waited, like 3 more days before any news source even called it. And lastly, the not shock of all not shocks, John K. Fetterman actually managed to win the Pennsylvania Senate seat. There literally is nothing I can say because this was such a obvious outcome from the day Fetterman announced that I can't even begin to talk about it. I will say this, I was like the one person who was talking about this race long before anybody else was. Like, I mean, Kyle Kalinske, like all these people, they didn't talk about Fetterman until like literally the last week. And this seems to be a common theme. Like the big name progressive organizations and like groups, they don't seem to talk about these races until like really it's too late. Like, I mean, I saw all these progressive organizations go like, see, this is this big thing about Fetterman. Like, Fetterman winning is a very big thing. It's like, you didn't back him. PCCC, you didn't back Fetterman. Why are you going on this big trend of like, oh yeah, Fetterman is so cool. Fetterman's win is a big. It's like, then why didn't you back him? And if their viewpoint is that, oh well, they didn't back Fetterman because Fetterman's probably not like an explicit progressive, but it's like, then why are they backing Lucas Kunce in Missouri? Who basically has that same issue. But regardless, it doesn't matter. Fetterman won, and he's very likely to win in this cycle because, I mean, the only two people who are possibly going to run against him are either Dr. Oz, who he's already been projected to beat, and a guy who nobody's heard of, so he probably has an advantage there too. Now, there are 2 weird sort of things that happened financially for this race that I want to get into before the main thing. One of the things that ended up becoming a big talking point for a lot of people was the money that went into this seat in this race. And AIPAC spent a lot of money in this race. Seemingly, from the reports that I've been seeing, they spent $4.3 million in these races. I think maybe they might have funneled more money into certain other races than others, but I don't know. That one I went by the numbers that were already established through the mainstream media. The second one I actually decided to do something different for. You see, another PAC that I think I mentioned previously in another episode, but I paid no mind to it a lot, was the Protect Our Future PAC. For those who don't know, the Protect Our Future PAC is this new PAC that came right out of nowhere that seemingly makes these weird endorsements and funnels a lot of money into certain candidates. They're apparently backed by a crypto-oriented billionaire who's made endorsements to Republicans in the past. But I actually did decide to go to the FEC page that had a bunch of their finances and take all of the amounts that were funneled into the candidates that were in this cycle on this day and then add them all together. And what I found was that the Protect Our Future PAC spent $16,455,841 on the May 17th races. Now, this is why it's more interesting. They only backed 3 people on this day: Carrick Flynn in Oregon District 6, Valerie Foushee in North Carolina District 4, and Morgan McGarvey in Kentucky District 3. Now, as you can tell, 2 of those people are the nominees in these districts. Carrick ended up losing, and what's interesting is that apparently, if the numbers are right, if my additions are to be corroborated, 10 million of that money went to Carrick. Because I've seen, like, all the news people are saying, like, oh, 10 million was funded into this one race. So if that's accurate with my numbers, then I don't have, this is weird. It's so perplexing that this is a thing. But I guess there's really not much else for me to say, except maybe pay attention to what the Protect Our Future PAC is doing. And the weird thing is that they're apparently backing people that aren't that bad. Like, they're backing, like, Jasmine Corkett and Maxwell Frost and Cindy. Like, one of the interesting things is that I actually made, like, a funny conspiracy theory that I'm actually starting to think, wait, is this real? Because it seems that they seem to have a lot of common endorsements with Mondaire Jones. So, is he affiliated with this PAC in some capacity? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But anyways, now let's move on to the main topic of this video. Finally, I didn't expect to be talking about news stories for that long, but we are finally here to talk about the Colombian presidential election. The first round is going to be on the 29th, so this is the final week of the campaign, at least for now. And as I've done with other countries before, I'm going to give you basic information about the cycle and some things that might make this notable. Like, why the heck am I talking about it at all? Spoilers, we could be seeing some good. First, what's the prelude to this? Well, actually, believe it or not, I actually technically already have an episode that gives sort of a direct prelude to what's happening in this cycle, with episode 154. You can choose to watch that episode or not. I'll give a basic summary of what happened. Basically, the incumbent president, Ivan Duque, tried to raise taxes during the COVID pandemic in order to pay for a UBI system, as well as attempting to privatize their healthcare system. That led to massive amounts of protests against the Duque government. And as most Latin American protests usually end up doing, is that there usually ends up being massive police oppression against the protesters, and the protesters eventually demand the president to resign. It's a common theme. You know, Latin Americans just love protesting against their leaders. I always make this joke. If you think a Latin American country doesn't like their leaders, don't worry, they'll let you know. Now, hearing that there was this massive protest movement against a conservative government might make you immediately think Chile, because a very similar situation recently happened to Chile. Government tries to take away some sort of, like, basic system that is needed for survival, and lo and behold, it spirals into protests demanding the president resign. So many people think a leftist win might actually be on the horizon, because that's what happened in Chile. Now, Duque is sort of a continuation of a political trend in Colombia called Uribism, which is a right-wing ideology that was created by Alvaro Uribe, the former president of Colombia, which is basically this broadly right-wing ideology that's like anti-communist, radical, like economic liberalism. You know, much like how every single branch of like left-wing ideologies in Latin America usually just end up being like a similar strand of things. Like they come from a basic similar root, but they branch off into a different direction. One major thing that I did miss out on in that video, which I probably should not have, is something that could also play a major part in this cycle, and arguably maybe it already has. You see, this is going to be the first election cycle in Colombian history, at least in recent history, where the left will be 100% focused on electoralism, because I somehow missed the long-standing conflict with Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, or the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. FARC is a far-left revolutionary resistance group, you know, like the Zapatistas, Sandinistas, Movimiento 26 de Julio, which was formed in 1964. It's not the only far-left revolutionary guerrilla group that Colombia has. They've had the National Liberation Army, the Popular Liberation Army, the Indigenous Revolutionary Armed Forces of the Pacific, M19, but FARC ended up becoming the most prominent one. Now, since I'm trying to focus on the election itself, I can't necessarily go too much in depth about the history of FARC. That would probably be reserved for like a bad empanada video. But quick summary is that membership peaked at 18,000 people. They've been involved with multiple kidnappings, assassinations, illegal mining, and the drug trade. In fact, they seemingly have gotten into a lot of conflicts with drug cartels, which seems to be a common thing for modern-day revolutionary socialist groups. But one of the most interesting things that happened was during the presidency that preceded Duque, Juan Manuel Santos, he pushed for a massive peace agreement with FARC. Like, he was basically like, this conflict has gone on for long enough. We're going to actually try and implement peace. And throughout negotiations, they actually managed to reach a peace agreement in 2016. And to show that the peace agreement was final, FARC turned over all of their weapons to the UN and basically reformed themselves into a political party named Commons. And part of the peace agreement was that Commons would be guaranteed a certain number of seats in the House of Representatives. However, there are technically some FARC dissidents that don't approve of this and have continued to fight revolutionary fights, but they've essentially been more of a background thing and haven't necessarily been as prominent as FARC used to be. And the last thing that sets up this cycle is the March 13th elections, because they're one of those countries that hold their elections on different days. For the legislative branch, they've actually managed to do pretty interesting things, with the left-wing coalition Historic Pact being seen as the victor. You see, through proportional representation, they managed to get 21 out of 102 of the Senate seats and 33 out of 166 of the representative seats. Now, things are a little bit confusing when I had to add in the numbers, because there's sort of this weird thing where, there would be candidates that would be of joint lists of certain other factions. For example, I counted not just the people who were on the ballot as Historic Pact, but I also counted the people who were Historic Pact and Green Alliance, which is a separate coalition. I don't know if I should have, but I did. And I also counted the indigenous seats that are aligned with the party. Like the people who are not explicitly, they are explicitly part of the coalition, but they're indigenous people who are guaranteed seats. The Mace, the Mace Party, which is an indigenous party, which is basically guaranteed a seat, I counted them as well because they were explicitly a member of the Historic Pact. I didn't count people who were sort of tertiary associated with the party, like Commons. Commons isn't technically part of the Historic Pact, but they've lent their support to Historic Pact, so their seats are not counted, I don't think. There was also apparently a huge problem with the votes, because there were just some votes that just weren't counted for a long period of time, even though it was reported that the Historic Pact won the most legislative seats. For some reason, the vote totals were never published until, the Historic Pact was hey, can you publish the results now? And oh, okay. Which seems to be a really weird thing. You see, that can kind of tie into the three major points of this cycle. See, the three major pieces of, things that are, at the forefront of the candidacies are corruption, violence, and maintaining the FARC peace agreement. Those seem to be the big three issues for this cycle, and certain people are lumping certain parts of it together. Maybe right-wing candidates are lumping FARC dissidents as part of the violence problem, or maybe they're saying that the FARC peace agreement was part of, corruption or something like that. But basically, those are the three main issues. I think also another one is just a general poverty issue, which you'll see as we go into the candidates. Speaking of, let's just get into it. Now we're finally going to talk about the players of this race. This is one of those ones where people are more generally on the same level playing field to a degree. Well, I guess some are rising to the top and others are staying near the bottom. Generally, this is one of those ones where it's not this is pretty obviously a two-man race. It's not like the South Korean race where it was literally Lee Jae-myung versus the other guy, and the rest were just there. These guys have all generally sort of reached a level playing field, although technically there is a divide in regards to how prominent they are. And some of these people have actually shifted how prominent they are. And things have also shifted because a lot of people have entered and dropped out of the race, which we'll get into in the latter section. But first, these are the people that are still in the race. First, a guy on the way bottom, John Milton Rodriguez of Free Fair Colombia. He is a senator, and his running mate is Sandra de la Lajas Torres, a professional in finance and business. Now, I'm mentioning the running mates because one weird thing, it's like an interesting thing, but it's like also weird to a degree. You see, the way Colombia works is that the runner-up doesn't just lose. Here's how it works. In Colombia, the president and vice president, whoever wins, but the president, like the person who was the top of the ticket that was runner-up, like the runners-up actually managed to get positions of power. If you're the second place presidential candidate, you end up becoming a member of the Senate. If you are the runner-up of the vice president, then you become a member of the Colombian House of Representatives. But back to John. John is the Free Fair Colombia Party is an evangelical Protestant party. Honestly, there's not much else to say. He's basically remained as like that random fringe right-wing guy. Though I have to give him credit, he hasn't dropped out yet. So I guess good on him for that. A level above him, we have Enrique Gomez Martinez of the National Salvation Movement. He is a lawyer and a member of the famous Gomez political family. He is the brother of former Representative Miguel Gomez Martinez. He's the grandson of former President Laureano Gomez. And he's the nephew of three-time presidential candidate Alvaro Gomez Hurtado, who gained prominence after he was kidnapped and assassinated by FARC. Gomez's running mate is Carlos Cuartas, a businessman. Gomez is running under the ballot line that his uncle used during his last run, the National Salvation Movement, which is basically a conservative party founded to oppose the Colombian Conservative Party. One thing I should have also mentioned is that the Colombian Conservative Party and the Colombian Liberal Party, which are basically what's considered the political establishment of Colombia, and also the Party of You, which is another political party, they're technically not running candidates in this cycle for various reasons, which we'll get into. But these two that I mentioned are sort of seen as like the bottom tier. Like these guys, like I mean, you go to websites talking about the Colombian guys, these guys are rarely mentioned at all. It's really mostly these four people that are mentioned, and even then, the next two are basically sort of in the same vein. The next person I'm going to talk about is someone who was supposed to be sort of the third wheel of the race, but he couldn't even accomplish that. Sergio Fajardo of the Hope Center Coalition. He is the former governor of Antioquia and a 2018 presidential candidate. His running mate is Luis Gilberto Murillo, a former minister of the Environment and Sustainable Development and a brief presidential candidate. As the name suggests, the Hope Center Coalition is a coalition of parties that are mostly in the center, like New Liberalism, the Dignity Party, the Colombia Resurgent Party, and the Independent Social Alliance. The coalition's principles were essentially made to be incredibly vague and mostly veer towards the center. Basically, here are their 9 principles: build collectively, protect life, privilege the common good and equity, always tell the truth, protect public resources, guarantee dialogue and civic participation, limit the exercise of power, defend freedom, equality, and human dignity, reconcile and build. Again, basically, it's just a centrist circle jerk. Sergio Fajardo especially adheres to the third way political philosophy. Basically, he only, if anything, he, slightly veers left. Sort of like in the Tony Blair-ish way of, veering the left. But the thing is, he's basically the centrist candidate, or at least that's what he was posing himself to be. Specific policies that Fajardo is in favor of is fighting youth unemployment, improving public security, addressing gender inequality by creating a women's ministry, and free college. Asterisks, it has to be in person though. Now, he was basically poised to be the main centrist candidate, but another person has sort of entered that is kind of, you'll see what I mean in a second. That person being Rodolfo Hernandez, running under GSC, League of Anti-Corruption Governors. He's a businessman and former mayor of Bucaramanga, running under a GSC. A GSC, for those who don't know, is Grupo Signativo de Ciudadanos, also a significant group of citizens. He's basically running as an independent under that name. Like, that technically isn't a real party, not yet. This cycle would technically determine if that is a real party or not. But he basically just said, hey, can I run a bunch of candidates under this like a banner and not have it formally recognized as a political party yet? And they go, okay. Again, this cycle would be what determines whether or not that's a party or not. His running mate is Marilyn Castillo, who is a journalist. Hernandez is basically running a candidacy focused on anti-corruption. He's sort of like a big tent populist, rejecting political labels from the left and right, and focusing much on the anti-corruption rhetoric. For lack of a comparison, he's pretty much like Andrew Yang, not in the traditional sense of like, oh, I'm a centrist, but of a brand new, like a brand of centrism, which in 10 years will eventually become the mainstream viewpoint of centrism. Now, while he focuses a lot on anti-corruption, he does have other policies as well. He wants to cut wasteful government spending. He wants to reduce the VAT tax to 10%. He also said that he's interested in flat out removing the VAT tax for food. He wants to reestablish relationships with Venezuela so that they don't be forced to immigrate to Colombia. And one of the interesting things about how he's tried to run his campaign is that, again, he's tried to be like an Andrew Yang or a Franco Parisi. He's mostly focused his campaign online and has essentially tried to paint himself as like this, oh, I'm like this new brand of populist type candidacies, even though he's a 76-year-old man. One of the big things he's been doing is like basically saying like, haha, I'm like a quirky old man who's like doing TikTok dances. That's so crazy. That's so lol random. Populism Updates essentially tried to build this huge brand around him. Like, this guy's so weird. This guy's making this Colombian election really interesting. He's like this quirky, weird grandpa. And it's like, yeah, but there are also a lot of things about him politically that are very weird. And maybe you should talk about these instead. Like, for example, I'm just going to jump out with the biggest one right out the gate. In 2016, he stated that he was a follower of Adolf Hitler. I'm not kidding. Now, he reportedly wanted to say Albert Einstein, but then said Adolf Hitler. But it's just like, what? Now, to rewind a little bit, remember when I talked about the fact that he was a mayor? Well, you see, here's the thing. He was actually a mayor on and off. He was suspended from his mayoralty from 2 separate occasions before he ended up resigning from it. Now, the first time was that he tried to influence voters during an election. The other time he was suspended was when he hit a member of his city council. Okay, that's a thing he did apparently. And apparently hot mics are a thing that hurts Rodolfo a lot, because he said 2 things that are definitely really weird. One is basically continuing on a trend that I just mentioned, where he threatened to shoot a person who was a client of a construction company that he was working on, and they were talking crap about his work, and he's like, oh, you're insulting the company that I own? I should shoot you. Now, the second one actually is way more interesting to me, because it literally goes against the thing that he's supposed to be running on. It was where he was caught on a hot mic selling slots to his congressional slate for up to $250,000 plus 10% of their salary if they get elected. So let me rephrase this. The anti-corruption candidate literally sold slots of his congressional slate to people, promising them a position in his candidacies, and said, if you do this thing, I want you to do me favors. He wants their money. That's weird. Usually the rich guys buy candidates. The candidates don't buy the millionaire. Now here's the thing. He actually tried to defend this by saying that it doesn't count because he's not an elected official. so it doesn't count as corruption. And it's like, this is so dumb. Like, this guy has even been compared to Donald Trump to a degree, and, it's kind of expected at this point that he'd be compared to Donald Trump. But this guy has steadily gained popularity, especially thanks to freaking populism updates, giving them free coverage, even though they're very blatantly not the cool person they keep claiming they are. But whatever. Now, lastly, we've reached the top 2 people. These are the ones that most people have kind of focused on as, like, the real people who are potentially going to be president, though Rodolfo has steadily risen to be near those 2. First, we have Federico Fico Gutierrez of the Team for Colombia. He's the former mayor of Medellin. His running mate is Rodrigo Lara Sanchez, the former mayor of Nieva. He is basically running under the mainstream right-wing coalition. Like, 3 members of the coalition I should mention are Partido Mira, which is a conservative political party, Party of the Yuh, which was the centrist party of Juan Manuel Santos, and the Colombian Conservative Party. So obviously Fico is more of the right-wing candidate. His policies are fighting corruption, improving public security, reducing inequality, boosting job creation, and aiming for a 5% economic growth, and reduce unemployment to single digits by investing in agricultural and housing construction. Somewhat vague policies, but I guess it's good for the people who support him. But the biggest candidacy comes from Gustavo Petro of the Historical Pact. Petro is a senator, former mayor of Bogota, former M19 member, and a perennial presidential candidate. His running mate is Francia Marquez, an activist and runner-up for the Historic Pact nomination. The Historic Pact is obviously the left-wing coalition, and it has quite a few party members. There's Humane Colombia, which is Petro's party. There's the Patriotic Union, the Colombian Communist Party, MAIS, which is the Indigenous and Social Alternative Movement, the Alternative Democratic Pole, the Labor Party of Colombia, Democratic Unity, We Are All Colombia, Citizen Power, Movement for the Defense of the Rights of People, Free Citizens, People's Congress, Movement for the Popular Constituent Assembly, Movement for Water and Life, Democratic Integration Movement, Indigenous Authorities of Colombia, and the Broad Democratic Alliance. But there are some people who are not part of the coalition formally that are also supporting Petro, including but not limited to the Colombia Federation of Education, Citizen, which is the Force Party, Citizen Force Political Movement, Independence, which is the name of a party and not just Independence, We Are Ready, and most prominently, Commons. As you can see, pretty large movement. Despite the fact that movement was so large, Petro was the very easy frontrunner. I didn't go in depth about the primary of the Colombian Conservatives or the Hope Center, but they did hold primaries to contend who will be the people, and sure enough, Petro actually, in his coalition primary, it was nowhere close. Petro won 80% of the vote. Francia got like I mentioned, she was the runner-up. She barely got anything, and she was still she ran a good campaign. Obviously, she was chosen to be the running mate, but she was nowhere close to Petro's numbers. Now, what is Petro actually standing for? Well, basically, these are Petro's policies: universal healthcare, public banking, land reform, getting off fossil fuels, putting Ivan Duque on trial, declaring a state of emergency to address hunger. But it seems that his biggest policy plank, from what I've seen, is something called Perdón Social, also known as social forgiveness. From what I gather, it is basically a less harsh criminal justice platform. I couldn't necessarily find something that actually definitively stated what it was, but from the general concept, it seems that basically he wants to take a lot of criminals, or if not all criminals, and wipe the slate clean, I guess, or maybe not force their criminal sentences to hurt them when they get out of prison, something like that. Basically a less harsh criminal justice platform like defund the police or abrazos no balazos, something that's more of a general concept rather than like a specific policy plank. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times that there are some people who have run, but one of the people that was running, which leads us into the events of the campaign, was Oscar Ivan Zulaga. This person was the candidate of the incumbent party, the Democratic Center Party. Like, these were the people who Duque is a member of. They were originally running candidacy, but they couldn't even remotely be close to anybody else in the race, so they dropped out and backed Fico. Now, one of the earliest things that happened in the election that was actually kind of interesting was sort of the beginning of like a Colombian political meme. Okay, so basically here's what happened. On March 21st, they held a presidential debate. Gustavo Petro didn't attend the debate for some reason. I don't know why he didn't attend, but he didn't show up. I guess there was a scheduling conflict. There was a problem with him not attending, though. He was the front runner, and when the front runner doesn't even show up to a presidential debate, what are the other candidates supposed to do? Especially when one of them is trying to surpass the front runner, and Federico Gutierrez decided that he was going to do something to try and show up Gustavo Petro. This is a common thing that people like to do. Like, they try to do something to make it so that the person who doesn't show up to the debate feels like they're in the wrong. So basically, here's what he did. Federico Gutierrez brought a picture of Gustavo Petro to the debate and basically was trying to make some sort of point like, well, this guy doesn't show up to the debate. And maybe he was trying to direct his answers to this Petro picture. And that was supposed to be this big thing, haha, I got you. You didn't show up to the debate. I had to make you show up with a picture. But the problem was that immediately backfired and became a political meme for people who were trying to indicate that Fico was supporting Petro. These are some of the ones that I copied and pasted in the English translations of them, obviously. Federico Gutierrez, for whom should we vote for? And it would show a picture of Fico pointing at the Gustavo picture. And the winner of this presidential debate without attending is Gustavo Petro. This man that I show in this photo is called Gustavo Petro, and he will be the next president of Colombia. And one of the common things that ended up happening was that they would draw an X over Petro's picture. Now, you might think that might indicate that they don't like Petro, but actually that means that they love Petro, because in Latin American countries, usually photos of the candidates or party logos are printed on the ballot, and you're supposed to cross out the one that you vote for. I know for a fact that in Mexico, one of the big things that they keep pushing, because I follow the PT account on social media, is that they kept showing pictures of PT with an X over them, and I'm like, is that supposed to be a good thing? And it's yeah, it's actually a good thing. Now, the next thing that ended up happening for Colombian politics that was interesting for the campaign trail happened on 420. Now, I know you're all going to be posting in the comments, haha, 420 blaze it, haha. And now you're probably curious what the heck happened. Well, 7 Colombian soldiers were killed by El Clan del Golfo, the Gulf Clan, a powerful drug cartel within the country. Yeah, not really 420 blaze it no more, huh? Now, Petro released a statement in regards to what happened. His statement stated this: while the soldiers are killed by the clan of the Gulf, some of the generals are on the clan's payroll. The leadership is corrupted when drug trafficking politicians end up being promoted to generals. Basically trying to make a point in regards to this event and how it ties into a political trend. Soon afterwards, the head of the Colombian military, Eduardo Enrique Zapatero, would write a 6-tweet response to Petro, which I decided to, instead of just paraphrasing, that I just read it in full. There is no one who is hurt more by the death of a soldier than those of us who wear camouflage, and of course their families and the country itself, but their supreme sacrifice for the country should not be used in campaign political narratives. Since 2021, more than 500 soldiers have been killed and wounded during the fulfillment of the mission, and their sacrifice was invisible. There were no pronouncements. Curious that now the death of the heroes of the country does generate affliction and is used for other remarks. Senator, do not use your investiture, parliamentary involvability, to pretend to engage in politicking with the death of our soldiers. Rather comply with your citizen duty of substantiated denouncement before the fiscal call of the facts that you mention, whoever be. I remind you that as a senator, you are part of the group you dare to point out as drug trafficking politicians. As a citizen, I recommend that you do not generalize, respect above all. I have not seen any general on television receiving ill-gotten money. Colombians have seen you receive money in a garbage bag. To the oldest institution in this country, whose members, men and women, unconditionally have defended the democracy of this nation for more than 200 years, even offering their own lives, I demand respect. Now, that 6-tweet thread is way more important than you realize. Here's why. As per Article 219 of the Colombian Constitution, members of the public force may not exercise the function of suffrage while they remain in active service, nor intervene in activities or debates of political parties or movements. And the head of the Colombian military openly calling out a politician seemed to be very greatly intervening in the politics of Colombia. Like, I mean, if it was like the first two tweets, then it'd be one thing, but he directly points to Petro and says, like, Petro, you're the problem, not the soldiers. And, like, not even just, like, generally, like, the guy point blank calls out politicians and calls out Petro in specific. That is a big deal in Colombia because it says point blank, you can't do that. That's not allowed. He'd have to resign from his position to do that. And I tweeted, like, when I found out that happened, I think that was like a couple of days after that happened, it's like, oh yeah, this is totally fine. This is totally fine. The leader of the Colombian military is, like, breaking the law of Colombia and, like, openly engaging in flame wars with the leading socialist presidential candidate. It's fine. This is fine. This is gonna be fine. There's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing to panic about. Nothing about anything about this. Or it's fine. It's gonna be fine, man. Come on, man. This is gonna be a big deal. No. What's this? The other two major candidates, Fajardo and Fico, have actually called him out on this. What? This thing that's really condemnable from every side of the political aisle? Like, this is fine. This isn't a big deal. This is fine. It's probably gonna be fine. Now, the next major thing happened 7 days later, and it was, again, just mostly focused on the political side of things. Because, like I mentioned, there are, like, the three major parties of Colombia prior were the conservatives, the liberals, and the Party of You. So we saw that the conservatives and the Party of You are backing Fico. What's the Colombian Liberal Party going to do? They weren't running a candidate, so clearly there was something that they were going to do. Well, they ended up deciding what to do. They decided to endorse Fico's candidacy. I mean, honestly, there isn't much to say. They just decided one day, hey, let's endorse Fico. And sure enough, that's what happened. Not much else I can really say. Now, the next thing didn't happen until a couple of days later, May the 2nd. Seemingly innocuous. Petro was supposed to do an event at the Colombian coffee region. You know, the region of Colombia that is heavily focused on coffee production. Everything was so hunky-dory and blah, 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 but it was all happy and everything. But then Petro had to cancel the event. And many people were like, yo, what the heck, dude? Why'd you cancel the event? And then he published a statement on Twitter saying, yeah, I was gonna go to the event, but the La Cordilla gang planned to assassinate me, so I kind of had to not go there to live. Clearly, the established interests in Colombia seem to be scared of Petro. The last somewhat major thing that happened in the election was there was a candidate that was sort of in the mid-tier with Rodolfo Hernandez and Sergio Fajardo named Ingrid Betancourt. She dropped out of the race. She was the only female candidate in the race, and she ended up backing Rodolfo Hernandez. Really weird thing. I don't know why. She was mostly focused on environmentalism, so I really don't get why she would back Rodolfo Hernandez. I don't know. but she did. So anyways, now let's go to the polling. Polling has been relatively consistent to a degree, but things are definitely reaching a boiling point. You see, through the entire race, Petro has been polling high. Ever since the speculation for the next cycle happened, Petro has been polling high. Usually, he polled nearly 20 points ahead, but as the race gets closer, things are, of course, getting to a shorter margin. The most recent first-round poll that I've seen, Petro has 37.9%, which is a noticeable decline from the poll right before, where he was leading by a very sizable margin. Fico has 30.8%, which is a steady increase in support. Hernandez has 20.3%, a sharp increase in support, and Fajardo has a 4.3%, which is a noticeable decline from when he used to have double digits. As you can see, these four are sort of seen as the main contenders, as I mentioned before, and the race is essentially boiled down to Petro versus whoever else. Nobody has really done any polling to at least recently, nobody's been doing polling of Fajardo v. Gutierrez, or Gutierrez v. Hernandez, or Hernandez v. Fajardo, because nobody expects those rounds to happen. Petro is 100% expected to make it to the second round. That's one thing you can bet on. He will 100% make it to the second round, and it's expected that he's going to be the leader in the first round. And in the most recent polls for the second round that I've seen, here is the results. Petro v. Fajardo is 41 to 34. So, again, Fajardo is essentially dropped off the face of the earth. Petro v. Gutierrez is 45 to 39. Somewhat close, but again, not that much. And lastly, we have Petro v. Hernandez, 39.8 to 42.2. And another poll that has been released, which shows different numbers, it is a poll that has shown Petro with 47.3, Hernandez with 21.4, Gutierrez with 21.1, and Fajardo with 5.1. So as you can see, the most competitive person that could actually beat Petro is Hernandez. Hernandez is the only person who can beat Petro, and sure enough, it's a possibility that he could make it to the second round. We don't know. If you haven't guessed at this point, I'm backing Petro 100%, and obviously he has a good shot. Hopefully there's no coup or nothing of the sort, or Hernandez doesn't get a sharp increase in support. Hopefully that don't happen. Hopefully Petro manages to pull through. I'd like to see more Pink Tide 3.0. We lost in France, we lost in the Philippines, we lost in South Korea. Come on, give us our first W, Colombia. Please don't make us wait for Brazil to give us a W. So anyways, that's all I have to say on that. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check out my articles on the Independent Political Report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.